You can tell a lot about a man by the way he treats a child when he thinks nobody's watching. Claire Whitmore heard the sentence once at a charity gala in Manhattan, spoken casually between glasses of champagne and forced laughter, but she never believed it until the night she walked into Bellamy's Steakhouse on East 54th Street and saw the black single father near the window, teaching his little girl how to fold a cloth napkin across her lap like she belonged in a place neither of them could really afford. Outside, rain pressed softly against the glass, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons of gold and white. Inside, the restaurant glowed warm beneath hanging amber chandeliers, polished silver catching reflections from half-finished wine glasses and crystal water goblets. Claire barely noticed any of it. Her phone buzzed again in her hand. Another board member, another crisis. Another headline threatening the billion-dollar image she had spent 10 years building with sleepless nights and perfectly controlled smiles. Miss Whitmore? Her assistant whispered carefully beside her. The investors are already waiting upstairs, Claire nodded without looking away from the table by the window. The man sat with his back straight but relaxed, somewhere in his late 30s maybe, broad shoulders beneath a dark denim jacket faded at the seams, tired hands, kind eyes. The little girl across from him couldn't have been older than 7. Her braids bounced when she laughed, tiny silver beads clicking softly together every time she moved her head. Now remember, the man said gently, sliding the fork closer to her plate, small bites, Miss Brooks. Fancy restaurants charge extra if you scare the rich people. The little girl burst into giggles so bright and sudden that even a nearby waiter smiled. Claire felt herself pause. Really pause. Not the polite social version of listening she had mastered in boardrooms, but something quieter, something human. The man folded his own napkin carefully before helping the little girl fix hers again after it slipped onto the floor. No irritation, no embarrassment, just patience. Daddy, are these real candles? The girl whispered, staring at the table centerpiece like it belonged in a castle. Real enough to burn your eyebrows off, he replied solemnly. So maybe don't test it tonight. Another laugh. Softer this time. Claire's chest tightened unexpectedly. Bellamy's wasn't a place for people like him. She knew that because men in $1,000 suits often complained when someone looked out of place. But Elijah Brooks carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind money couldn't buy and power couldn't imitate. He studied the menu longer than most customers did, not because he was impressed, because he was calculating. Claire recognized that look immediately, the careful math of sacrifice, the silent subtraction parents made when they wanted their children to feel normal for one evening. A waiter arrived with 2 plates, 1 steak, 1 small stack of pancakes covered in strawberries and whipped cream. Naomi's eyes widened like Christmas morning. Daddy, she whispered, this looks expensive. Elijah smiled as he cut the pancakes into neat squares for her. That's because it comes with atmosphere. She laughed again, while Claire looked down at the untouched reservation folder, still hanging loosely in her hand. Somewhere behind her, investors waited for the woman. Forbes magazine called the coldest CEO in New York, but at the table beside the rain-streaked window, a tired black father was turning a $12 pancake into a memory his daughter might carry for the rest of her life. And for reasons Claire Whitmore could not explain yet, she suddenly couldn't stop watching. The private dining room upstairs smelled like expensive leather, dark coffee, and people who had learned to hide exhaustion behind polished smiles. Claire sat at the end of the long walnut table while investors argued over market losses projected across 3 glowing screens. Somebody mentioned legal exposure. Somebody else blamed the public relations team. Another man laughed too loudly at his own joke. Claire heard every word and absorbed none of them. Her attention kept drifting downstairs toward the rain-streaked window and the small table near the front of the restaurant. Claire? One investor asked carefully. Are you with us? She blinked once. Continue. Her voice remained calm, precise, controlled. It always did, but beneath the table, her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her phone. Through the glass wall overlooking the main dining floor, she could still see Elijah Brooks leaning closer to his daughter while she animatedly explained something with syrup-covered hands. And then, Mrs. Carter said the moon is technically moving all the time, Naomi announced proudly. Elijah widened his eyes with exaggerated seriousness. That explains why mine disappeared after I turned 30. Naomi groaned instantly. Dad, that was bad. No, he corrected gently. That was historic. The little girl laughed so hard she nearly dropped her fork. A few nearby diners glanced over, but Elijah never seemed embarrassed by her joy. Claire noticed that immediately. Most parents in upscale restaurants spent half the night apologizing for their children existing too loudly. Elijah did the opposite. He listened to Naomi like every sentence mattered. Miss Whitmore? Her assistant whispered again beside her chair. The partners want your final decision. Claire forced her eyes toward the presentation screen. Numbers, charts, risk projections. The entire room waited for her. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan traffic crawled slowly through the wet streets while thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the skyline. Move forward with the acquisition, Claire said automatically. Pens moved instantly across paper. Relief spread around the table. Yet even as million-dollar decisions reshaped entire departments upstairs, her mind remained downstairs with the father carefully cutting strawberries into heart shapes because his daughter smiled every time he did it. Then Claire noticed something small, something most people would never catch. Elijah glanced briefly at the menu again after the waiter walked away, not casually, carefully. His thumb rubbed once against the bottom corner like he was recalculating numbers in his head. A moment later, Naomi pointed excitedly toward a dessert tray passing nearby. Chocolate cake, ice cream, the kind served in oversized glasses with sparklers during birthdays. Elijah smiled instantly when he saw her face light up, but the smile faded just slightly before he answered. Maybe next time, kiddo. Naomi nodded too quickly. Children learn disappointment fast in homes where money stayed tight. Claire knew that expression even though she grew up surrounded by wealth. She had worn the same smile herself whenever her father canceled another family dinner for another board meeting. Pretend it does not hurt. Pretend you understand. Pretend love and absence can exist together. Elijah reached across the table and tapped Naomi gently on the nose. Tell you what, he said quietly. We will stop by that bakery near Lexington tomorrow after school. Deal? Naomi's entire face brightened again. The one with the giant cookies? The very same. Promise? Elijah held out his pinky finger. Miss Brooks, I am a man of honor. She hooked her tiny finger around his immediately. Claire looked away too fast after that. Something sharp and unfamiliar pressed against her chest. Not pity, not attraction. Something lonelier than both. Because for the first time in years, inside a restaurant filled with polished silver and people worth more money than most cities, Claire Whitmore realized she could not remember the last time anyone had looked at her with the kind of warmth Naomi Brooks looked at her father. By the time Claire finally left the investor meeting, Bellamy's had grown quieter. The dinner rush faded into the soft clinking of dishes and low jazz drifting through hidden speakers above the bar. Rain still traced silver lines down the windows facing Lexington Avenue. Most of the executives upstairs had already disappeared into black SUVs and waiting town cars, but Claire lingered near the staircase longer than necessary. She told herself she needed air, space, a moment without people demanding something from her every second. But deep down, she knew she was looking for the table near the window again. Elijah and Naomi were still there. Naomi now sat with her chin resting on folded arms, while Elijah stirred the last bit of coffee in his mug. Steam curled upward beneath the warm restaurant lights. He looked tired when he thought nobody noticed. Not dramatic exhaustion, not collapse. Just the quiet, kind parents carried because stopping was not an option. Naomi yawned hard enough to make him smile. Somebody is fading fast, he murmured. I am not tired, she protested instantly, even while rubbing one eye. Of course not, Elijah agreed solemnly. That explains why your eyeballs are trying to leave your face, she giggled sleepily. Claire watched him reach into his jacket pocket and pull out a tiny packet of crayons folded carefully inside a napkin. Naomi brightened immediately. You kept them? Miss Brooks, he said softly. A prepared father is a dangerous man. She began drawing on the paper placemat while Elijah glanced once more toward the check presenter resting beside his elbow. Claire noticed the movement immediately this time. He did not touch it yet, just looked at it. Then toward his daughter. Then away again. The waiter approached carefully. Whenever you are ready, sir, Elijah offered a polite smile. Thank you. The waiter walked off. Naomi continued coloring quietly, humming to herself beneath her breath while rain tapped gently against the windows beside them. Claire should have left. She knew that. Her driver waited outside. Tomorrow morning began at 6 sharp with another interview, another meeting, another room filled with people pretending money solved loneliness. Yet something anchored her there. Maybe it was the way Elijah kept looking at Naomi like she was the center of gravity in his world. Or maybe it was because nobody had ever looked at Claire Whitmore that way before. Not even when she was little, especially not then. Across the restaurant, Elijah finally opened the leather check holder. His expression barely changed. That was what caught Claire most. No panic, no frustration. Just that same quiet calculation again. He slipped a hand into his wallet slowly. A few folded bills, one debit card worn pale at the edges. Naomi looked up from her drawing. Daddy? Can we come here again someday? Elijah looked at her for a second before smiling gently. Yeah, baby. Someday. He said it warmly enough that she believed him completely. Claire looked down at the diamond watch on her wrist, worth more than most people's yearly rent, and suddenly felt something close to shame. Upstairs, investors had argued for 40 minutes over whether cutting employee health care would improve quarterly profits by 3%. Meanwhile, downstairs, a father quietly debated whether he could afford dessert without letting his daughter notice the difference. Elijah slid the debit card into the folder at last, then leaned back while Naomi proudly held up her drawing. That is us, she announced. Claire could barely see it from across the room. Crayon lines, a tiny table, two smiling stick figures beneath yellow lights. And that one is you making your serious face at the pancakes. Elijah laughed softly under his breath. I do not make serious faces at pancakes, Naomi pointed immediately. You do when they cost $16. Elijah froze for half a heartbeat before both of them burst into laughter together. Real laughter. Unfiltered. The kind that filled empty spaces money never could. And standing alone near the staircase in her tailored gray coat, Claire Whitmore realized she had spent most of her life inside beautiful rooms that never once sounded like home. Sometimes embarrassment arrives quietly, not with shouting, not with disaster, just a blinking machine and a few extra seconds of silence that suddenly feel too heavy to carry. Elijah slid the check holder back toward the edge of the table, while Naomi finished coloring tiny stars around the stick figures on her paper placemat. The waiter returned with the practice smile restaurants taught their staff to wear: polite, efficient, invisible. He picked up the folder and disappeared toward the register near the bar. Naomi leaned sleepily against the booth cushion. Can we walk home slow tonight? She asked softly. Why slow? Elijah smiled. Because the rain makes the sidewalks shiny. Elijah looked toward the window where city lights shimmered across wet pavement like melted gold. Yeah, he said quietly. We can walk slow. A minute later, the waiter returned. This time his smile looked tighter around the edges. I am sorry, sir, he said carefully, lowering his voice. The card did not go through. Naomi immediately stopped coloring. Elijah blinked once. That is strange. He reached for the wallet again, while the waiter stood awkwardly beside the table. Nearby conversations continued softly beneath the jazz music, but Elijah could feel the shift anyway. The invisible weight of attention. People always noticed discomfort, even when they pretended not to. Elijah slid the card back into the folder. Try it again for me, please. Of course, sir. The waiter walked away. Naomi stared down at her crayons now. Daddy, it is okay, baby. His voice remained calm enough to settle storms. Probably the bank acting dramatic again, she nodded, though her small shoulders curled inward slightly. Across the room near the staircase, Claire watched everything unfold with a strange tightness in her chest. Nobody else seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed and decided it was not their problem. A man in an expensive navy suit laughed loudly at the bar. Someone ordered another bottle of wine without looking at the price. Life continued, but Claire saw Naomi's expression change immediately. Children recognized financial fear long before adults admitted it existed. The waiter returned again, slower this time. I am really sorry, sir. Elijah inhaled once through his nose before offering an apologetic smile that somehow protected everyone except himself. Can you give me 1 second? Of course. The waiter stepped back. Elijah opened his banking app quickly beneath the table, thumb moving across the cracked phone screen. Claire looked away instinctively, suddenly feeling like she was witnessing something private. Not poverty, pride. There was a difference. Elijah checked the balance once, then again. Rent had cleared early. The automatic payment must have processed tonight instead of tomorrow morning. For half a second, exhaustion flickered across his face before disappearing beneath composure again. Naomi watched him carefully. "Daddy," she whispered, "we can skip the bakery tomorrow." Elijah looked up immediately. "Hey," his tone softened. "No sad faces at my dinner table, remember?" "But, Miss Brooks," he interrupted gently, "you are 7 years old. Your current responsibilities are cartoons, homework, and surviving second grade. Leave the boring stuff to me." Naomi tried to smile for him. That almost hurt Claire more than if the little girl had cried. Because children who learned how to shrink their wants too early usually did it for someone they loved. Elijah pulled a few folded bills from his wallet slowly. Not enough. He knew it. The waiter probably knew it too. Claire glanced toward her assistant standing near the entrance. "Do not make a scene," she said quietly. "Excuse me?" "I said do not make a scene." Claire's eyes never left the table near the window. Rain continued sliding softly down the glass, while Elijah sat there trying to preserve his daughter's dignity with the same careful hands he had used to cut pancakes into heart shapes an hour earlier. And for reasons she could not fully explain yet, Claire Whitmore suddenly knew she could not walk away from this one. Claire moved before she could overthink it. That was unusual for her. Every major decision in her life had been measured, analyzed, negotiated behind glass walls and legal contracts. But this felt different, smaller, human. She crossed the restaurant floor quietly, heels softened by thick carpet, while her assistant hurried beside her, looking confused. "Call the manager over," Claire said under her breath. "Now." The assistant blinked. "Is something wrong?" Claire glanced toward Elijah's table where Naomi sat, pretending to color, while carefully avoiding looking at the leather check folder. "No," Claire replied softly. "Something is right." A few moments later, the restaurant manager approached quickly with the nervous posture wealthy customers often created in other people. "Miss Whitmore," he said immediately, "is everything satisfactory tonight?" Claire reached into her purse and handed him a black credit card without ceremony. "I want you to start a new promotion." The manager frowned politely. "Promotion? Family Appreciation Night," Claire said smoothly, already building the lie in real time. "Randomly selected guests receive complimentary dinner and dessert courtesy of the restaurant." The manager looked briefly confused. "Tonight? Tonight." He glanced toward Elijah's table and understood instantly. To his credit, he did not hesitate long. "Of course." Claire stopped him gently before he walked away. "One more thing." "Yes, ma'am?" Her eyes drifted toward Naomi again. "Do not let the little girl think this is charity." The manager's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Understood," across the room. Elijah still sat calmly despite the tension pressing quietly around the edges of the table. He had counted the cash twice already beneath the low restaurant lights. Not enough for tax and tip both. He could ask them to remove something from the bill, maybe. But Naomi would notice. Children always notice what adults tried hardest to hide. "Daddy," Naomi asked carefully, "can we help wash dishes if we have to?" Elijah stared at her for one stunned second before laughing softly under his breath. "You offering free child labor now?" She shrugged sleepily. "I am very good at rinsing." Before Elijah could answer, the manager suddenly approached their table, carrying a small dessert plate glowing beneath a candle flame. Chocolate cake, strawberries, vanilla ice cream slowly melting along the edges. Naomi's eyes widened instantly. "Oh," she whispered, "that is definitely not ours." The manager smiled warmly. "Actually, tonight your table was selected for Bellamy's new Family Appreciation Night." Elijah blinked once. "I am sorry?" "Your dinner and dessert have been fully covered by the restaurant this evening, sir." Silence settled briefly across the table. Naomi looked between them in confusion before her face lit up with cautious excitement. "Daddy," she whispered, "we won something." Elijah's eyes shifted slowly toward the staircase, toward Claire. She stood partially hidden near the shadows beside the bar, arms folded loosely across her coat. Their eyes met for the first time that night. Claire expected gratitude, maybe, surprise, embarrassment. Instead, Elijah simply looked at her quietly, thoughtfully, like he understood exactly what she had done and why she had done it that way. Then he looked back at Naomi before speaking. "Well," he said softly, "looks like the universe finally decided to stop being cheap." Naomi laughed immediately. Bright, relieved. The sound loosened, something deep inside Claire's chest she had not realized was tight. The manager placed the dessert gently on the table and walked away. Naomi stared at the giant slice of cake like it belonged in a museum. Can I really eat this? Tonight? Elijah smiled faintly. Absolutely. Naomi grabbed her spoon with both hands while Elijah remained still for another moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he looked back toward Claire again. No wounded pride, no performance. Just a quiet understanding passing between two strangers beneath warm restaurant lights and rain-streaked windows. And somehow that felt far more intimate than anything Claire Whitmore had experienced in years. The rain had softened into a thin silver mist by the time Elijah and Naomi finally stood to leave. Bellamy's had nearly emptied now, the late-night crowd reduced to quiet conversations and half-finished drinks glowing beneath low amber lights. Naomi clutched the leftover dessert box carefully against her chest like treasure, while Elijah helped her into her small yellow raincoat. Arms up, he said gently. Naomi obeyed with dramatic exhaustion. I think I ate too much cake to move. A dangerous medical condition, Elijah agreed. Very serious. She giggled sleepily while he zipped the coat all the way to her chin. Claire watched from beside the bar, one hand resting lightly against the polished wood counter. She should have left 20 minutes ago. Her driver had texted twice already. Tomorrow's schedule sat waiting on her phone like a list of obligations she no longer had energy to carry tonight. But something about the scene unfolding near the window held her there. Elijah adjusted Naomi's hood carefully before crouching to wipe a smear of chocolate frosting from the corner of her mouth using a folded napkin from his pocket. Small movements, gentle movements, the kind people rarely noticed unless they had spent a lifetime missing them. Naomi suddenly looked toward Claire and waved enthusiastically before Elijah could stop her. "Daddy," she whispered loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear. "That is the lady from before." Elijah straightened slowly. For one brief second, Claire considered pretending not to notice. Instead, she stepped forward calmly. Naomi smiled immediately. "Thank you for the cake." Claire blinked softly at the directness of it. "You are welcome." Naomi lifted the dessert box proudly. "I am saving half for tomorrow because Dad says fancy cake tastes even better the second day." Elijah rubbed the back of his neck once, faint embarrassment touching his expression. "Naomi." "What?" she asked innocently. Claire surprised herself by smiling. A real smile this time, small but real. "Your father might be right." Naomi seemed satisfied with that answer. Elijah finally met Claire's eyes fully beneath the warm restaurant lights. Up close, she noticed details she had missed from across the room. The exhaustion behind his calm expression, the faint crease in his jacket sleeve, where repeated stitching had repaired it by hand. The quiet steadiness in the way he carried himself despite everything tonight had threatened to take from him. "Miss Whitmore," he said politely. Claire paused slightly. "You know who I am?" Elijah gave a faint shrug. "Most people in Manhattan know who you are." His voice held no bitterness. No admiration either. Just fact. That unsettled her more than either would have. "Then you probably know Bellamy's does not usually hand out free dessert packages to random tables." Elijah glanced briefly toward Naomi before lowering his voice slightly. "I figured." Claire crossed her arms loosely against her coat. "You are not angry?" "Should I be?" "Some people do not like help." Elijah looked toward the rain-covered windows for a second before answering. "There is a difference between help and humiliation." His eyes returned to hers again. Calm, direct. "You protected my daughter from the second one." The restaurant suddenly felt quieter around them after that. Even the jazz music seemed farther away somehow. Claire opened her mouth once before closing it again. Strange. She negotiated billion-dollar mergers without hesitation, but one honest sentence from a tired father near the door of a steakhouse left her searching for words. Naomi yawned loudly between them. "Okay," Elijah said softly, resting a hand against his daughter's shoulder. "Somebody is officially shutting down." Naomi leaned against him immediately. Claire watched the little girl melt toward her father without fear or hesitation, complete trust written into every sleepy movement. Elijah adjusted the dessert box carefully so Naomi could keep holding it while half asleep. Then he looked back at Claire one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly. Not performative, not formal, just sincere enough to linger. Claire nodded once because anything more suddenly felt dangerous. Elijah guided Naomi toward the door, his hand resting lightly against the top of her hood as cold night air slipped inside the restaurant. Just before stepping into the rain, Naomi turned around again. "Good night, fancy lady." Claire laughed softly before she could stop herself. "Good night, Naomi." Then the door closed behind them, leaving only the fading sound of rain outside and the strange realization settling slowly into Claire Whitmore's chest that tonight, for the first time in years, someone had thanked her in a way that made her feel human instead of powerful. The strange thing about loneliness was how invisible it looked from the outside. By 8 the next morning, Claire Whitmore was back inside a world of polished marble floors, elevator chimes, and conference calls stacked so tightly together they barely left room to breathe. Assistants moved around her with tablets and schedules. Men in tailored suits nodded nervously whenever she entered a room. Somebody handed her coffee exactly the way she liked it without asking. Somebody else updated her on stock movement before she even sat down. Everything worked perfectly. That was the problem. Nothing in Claire's life ever paused long enough to feel real anymore. "Your 10 o'clock move to conference room B," her assistant informed her while walking beside her through the executive floor. "The Chicago investors also want a private dinner tomorrow evening." Claire nodded automatically, though her attention drifted toward the rain outside the massive windows overlooking Midtown. Gray skies, wet sidewalks, yellow cabs sliding through morning traffic. Somewhere out there, Elijah Brooks was probably already working his second shift of the day. The thought arrived unexpectedly. It stayed longer than it should have. During the meeting, Claire caught herself staring at a spreadsheet without absorbing a single number. Instead, she remembered the way Elijah adjusted Naomi's raincoat zipper with absent tenderness, like caring for her was as natural as breathing. No performance, no audience. Just love practiced quietly over time. "Claire?" one board member asked carefully. "Your thoughts?" She looked up immediately. "Reject the proposal." The room fell silent. "The labor cuts would damage retention long term," Claire continued smoothly. "Next item." Pens moved quickly again. Voices resumed. But inside her chest, something still felt unsettled. Around noon, Claire left the building through a private side entrance instead of using the underground garage. Her security detail exchanged surprised glances but followed anyway. Cold winds swept through the avenue, carrying the smell of rain and roasted chestnuts from a street cart nearby. For reasons she could not explain logically, Claire found herself walking 6 blocks downtown toward a small public library branch she had passed 100 times without noticing. Bellamy's sat across the street. Through the wide front windows, the restaurant looked ordinary in daylight, smaller somehow, less magical than it had beneath rain and candlelight. Claire almost turned around right there. Then she saw him. Elijah sat near the children's section inside the library, wearing the same faded denim jacket from the night before. Naomi leaned against his shoulder while he helped her sound out words from a science book spread open across the table. "Comet," Naomi whispered carefully. "Close," Elijah murmured patiently. "Try again. Comet. There you go." Naomi grinned proudly while Elijah tapped the page gently with his finger. Claire remained frozen outside the library window longer than she meant to. Nobody there recognized her. Nobody cared about market shares or interviews or magazine covers. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed softly overhead while children turned pages and librarians pushed carts filled with books across faded carpet. Elijah looked completely at home there. Naomi suddenly said something that made him laugh under his breath. Claire could not hear the words through the glass, but she saw the expression afterward. The warmth, the ease. It hit her unexpectedly hard. Because Claire Whitmore had spent her entire life around people trying to impress one another, manipulate one another, outperform one another. Yet the happiest person she had seen in months was a tired black father sitting in a public library helping his daughter pronounce the word comet correctly. Elijah reached into his backpack then and pulled out a sandwich wrapped carefully in foil. He handed the larger half to Naomi without hesitation. Claire noticed immediately that he kept the smaller piece for himself. Again, the same silent mathematics from Bellamy's. "Give her more. Pretend you need less." Naomi leaned against his shoulder while eating, completely safe in the world he built around her with whatever he had left after life took its share. Claire stood outside the library window, watching them longer than she should have. Long enough for something quiet and dangerous to settle inside her chest. Not fascination, not romance. Something softer than that. Something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Envy. Rain covered Manhattan in a soft silver haze by the time Elijah carried Naomi out of Bellamy's that night. The little girl slept against his shoulder now, one small arm looped loosely around his neck while her fever-warm cheek rested near his collar. Elijah held the umbrella awkwardly with one hand and balanced the dessert box beneath his arm with the other. Claire stood beneath the restaurant, awning watching him step carefully around puddles gathering along the curb. Yellow taxi lights blurred across wet pavement while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. "Miss Whitmore?" her assistant asked quietly beside her. "Your car is waiting," Claire barely heard her. Elijah moved slowly through the rain, adjusting the umbrella every few seconds so Naomi stayed completely dry, even while cold water soaked the shoulder of his own jacket. Not once did he seem annoyed by the inconvenience. Not once did he rush her weight from his arms. Halfway down the block, Naomi stirred weakly. "Daddy? I am here, baby. Did we forget the cake?" Elijah smiled faintly despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "Nope, the cake survived." Naomi relaxed again instantly. "Good." Claire watched them disappear into the glowing blur of the city until she could no longer separate them from the rain itself. Then she did something strange, something completely unlike her. "Find him," she said quietly. Her assistant blinked. "Excuse me? Elijah Brooks?" Claire folded her arms against the cold wind. "Find out where he works." The assistant hesitated carefully. "Why?" Claire looked toward the empty sidewalk where Elijah had vanished moments ago. She thought about the warmth in Naomi's voice every time she said daddy. She thought about a man who quietly skipped meals so his daughter could have pancakes beneath fancy restaurant lights. She thought about being 8 years old inside a silent penthouse, wishing someone would hold her the way Elijah held that little girl in the rain. "Because," Claire said softly, "good people should not have to struggle that hard just to stay good." The following Monday, Elijah arrived 30 minutes early for his evening maintenance shift at Whitmore Financial Tower in Midtown. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh coffee, while executives hurried toward elevators without noticing the workers cleaning around them. Elijah adjusted the strap of his backpack and signed into the service desk quietly. "Long weekend?" the security guard asked. Elijah chuckled softly. "You could say that." Naomi's fever had finally broken Sunday morning after 2 sleepless nights, cartoons on the couch, and enough great medicine to qualify as emotional trauma. Elijah still looked tired, but fathers learned how to keep moving through tiredness the same way New Yorkers learned how to walk through rain. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Elijah stepped inside alone and pressed the service floor button. Halfway up, the elevator stopped unexpectedly on the executive level. The doors slid open. Claire Whitmore stood there in a charcoal coat with a folder tucked beneath one arm. For one brief second, both of them looked equally surprised. Elijah straightened slightly. "Miss Whitmore!" Claire stepped into the elevator slowly. The doors closed behind her with a quiet metallic hum. Neither spoke for a moment while the elevator climbed higher through mirrored silence. Then Claire finally held the folder out toward him. Elijah frowned slightly before taking it. Inside sat a formal employment offer from Whitmore Financial. Full salary, benefits, day shift hours, educational support coverage for Naomi included. Elijah stared at the page longer than Claire expected. "You investigated me?" he asked finally. Claire answered honestly. "Yes." Elijah nodded once, though his expression remained unreadable. "That is a very expensive offer for a maintenance worker." "It is not charity," Claire said immediately. "Your former supervisor described you as the most reliable employee he ever had." Elijah looked back down at the paperwork quietly, while the elevator lights reflected softly across the worn edges of his backpack straps. "The hours would help Naomi," Claire added more gently this time. "You would be home evenings." Silence again, long enough for the elevator to reach the 38th floor. Elijah finally closed the folder carefully before handing it back to her. "Thank you," he said softly. "But no." Claire blinked once. "No? Right now," Elijah replied calmly. "My daughter needs time with her father more than your company needs another employee." The elevator stopped. Doors slid open. Neither of them moved immediately. Claire stared at him in complete silence, because in a world where everyone wanted something from her: money, approval, access, power, this man had just turned all of it down for one simple reason. A little girl with silver beads in her braids liked movie nights with her father more than fancy buildings and bigger paychecks. Elijah adjusted the strap on his backpack gently. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." Then he walked out into the bright executive hallway carrying nothing except his worn backpack, quiet dignity, and the kind of wealth Claire Whitmore suddenly realized she had been searching for her entire life.